All right. Hey, everybody. So good to be here today. I'm so glad that so many of you joined us. I am excited to tell you about habit-forming technology because if there's one thing that we have all seen over the past several years is that these gadgets that we are carrying with us every single day have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives. And so in the course of my research over the past several years, I wanted to answer why and how do these products that we carry around with us change consumer behavior? What patterns underlie some of the most successful products of the past several years? These products that started out as toys. And then within the span of a few short years, think 5 to 10 years, these products are touching the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of users, and they are making hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. Who am I talking about? What do you think of when you think of these companies? What companies come to mind? Shout out some companies. Apple, yeah, a little bit. What's more recent companies, 5 to 10 years? Who do you think of? Uber, Facebook. Facebook, just take Facebook, that one example. This company, back in 2006, when you first saw Facebook, did you really think it would be as massive as it is today? Touching 1 in 7 people on the face of the earth, worth $300 billion? Who else? What else comes to mind? Instagram, yeah, bought for $1 billion by Facebook. And what's funny about Instagram, I remember when Instagram was bought by Facebook, everybody in Silicon Valley, where I live, laughed at Facebook. They said, oh my God, Zuckerberg lost his mind, $1 billion for this stupid little photo sharing app? He's crazy. A couple months ago, a Wall Street bank tried to figure out how much Instagram would be worth today if it wasn't part of Facebook. Anybody want to take a guess? $35 billion. Who had the last laugh there? So what I wanted to try and do over the past several years is to try and understand what it is about these products that come out of nowhere and somehow change the daily behaviors of so many people's lives so that we can learn from this. I want to go outside the world of direct website conversion and buttons and optimization on the small scale. Let's talk macro. Let's talk big picture. Let's talk about patterns within the design of your product experience that fundamentally changes people's behaviors, people's habits, and people's lives. So there's a lot more information that I'm going to be able to cover today in my book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. I also teach a course at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford and the design school there. I'm not going to be able to talk about every case study in the book. If you have a chance, the book is $14 on Amazon. If you don't have $14, let me know. I can tell you where you can pirate the book online. Just check it out if you get a chance. So let's dive into habits. What are we talking about when we talk about habits? The definition of a habit, so we're all on the same page here, is nothing more than an impulse to do a behavior with little or no conscious thought. And it turns out that about half of what you do every day, day in and day out, is done purely out of habit. These behaviors done with little or no conscious thought. And I believe that we are on the precipice of an age where we can use habits for good. And I'm not alone. Because today there is an explosion of companies, many of them in the room today, who are using the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more connected, more productive lives. And that's what I want to help you do today. Sound good? All right, let's get to work. So this fundamental pattern that we see as the backbone of these companies that can so profoundly change our habits is called the hook. The hook is an experience designed to connect your user's problem to the company's solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting the user's problem with your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And what we find is that through successive cycles, through these 4 steps of the hook, this is how customer preferences are shaped, how our tastes are formed, and how these habits take hold. So let me walk you through the 4 basic steps of the hook. The first step to any hook is a trigger. Now, triggers are things that tell us what to do next. They give the user some piece of information for what the action should be. Now, these triggers come in 2 types, and the first type is called an external trigger. Now, you're very familiar with this, right? These are things that tell the user what to do next, where the information is inside the trigger itself. Click here, buy now, play this, a friend telling you through word of mouth about a great new product you should try out, a great new app. Those are all examples of external triggers. Now, we all know about this as consumers. This is kind of our craft in the conversion industry. We know all about these external triggers. But here's the thing. What I find people don't pay enough attention to, and yet turns out to be absolutely critical to forming consumer habits, is creating an association with what's called an internal trigger. Internal triggers are things that tell the user what to do next, but the information for what to do is not stored in the trigger. Instead, the information comes from a memory or an association inside the user's brain. So what we do when we're in a particular place, a certain situation, partaking in a routine, around certain people, and most frequently when we experience particular emotions, prompts us to action with little or no conscious thought. Now, the most frequently occurring internal triggers are these emotions, but not just any emotion. They are, in fact, negative emotions. So what we do when we're feeling lonely or bored or indecisive or fatigued or lost, what we do when we experience these negative emotions prompts us to action, and our brain, one thing that this 3.5 pounds of fat on the top of our necks is very good at, is finding solutions to our problems. Part of the evidence that shows that this is the case comes to us from a great study that found that people suffering from depression check email more. I just saw a few people here in the front row put away their phones. What's going on there? So why would people suffering from depression check email more? What's happening here? It turns out what this study found was that people suffering from clinical depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the rest of the population. So what are they doing to boost their mood, to get out of that negative valence state? They're going online, they're checking their devices, they're looking at email more often than the rest of the population. But of course, we all do this to some degree. We use products to modulate our mood. Let me give you some examples. What app do we check, or website do we check, when we're feeling lonely? Facebook, of course. Somebody here said Tinder, I think. Here. That's a different kind of lonely. What about, where do we go when we're feeling unsure? Before we scan our brains to see if we know the answer, what site are we on already? Google, of course. And what about when we're bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that big project you don't feel like working on. Where do you go? You check YouTube. You check stock prices. You check sports scores. You go on Reddit, right? You check the news. You check about what's going on with the election. All of these products and services are catering to this painful internal trigger of boredom. We don't like that sensation, and we seek to be taken out of that negative emotional state. And before we even realize what we're doing, we're already using these products and services because they have created that association, that tight link between the itch and the reward. And that, if you are building a habit-forming product, is critical. Can't tell you how many companies I meet with in my consulting practice, and I come in, I sit down with them, and they can tell me all about the fancy new technology they're using and the latest A/B test they've run and all these amazing things they've done to increase conversion. But when I ask them, okay, really, what itch are you scratching? What's the psychological requirement of your product? They haven't a clue. So if you're building a product that you want people to go to with little or no conscious thought, purely out of habit, if you want to rid yourself of constantly requiring more messages, more notifications, more spam sent to your customers, you're going to have to create an association with an internal trigger that brings the user to the product on their own. Let's do a quick case study here. How many of you use Instagram? Instagram users? Okay, terrific. A lot of you. Wonderful. Now, let's talk about external triggers and internal triggers when it comes to Instagram. External triggers for Instagram was people posting, hey, I just took a photo on Instagram, check it out. Here's a big button that says click here, install the app. Those are external triggers. And now that I have the app on my phone, I've got this big icon on my home screen, which is an example of an external trigger. And I start getting notifications from my friends, also examples of external triggers. Now let's talk about those internal triggers. Sir, did you say you use Instagram a lot? You use Instagram a lot? What's your name? Maurice. Do you remember the last thing you took a picture of with Instagram? If it's suitable for work? You never know. What was it? Do you remember? A what? Oh, the Capitol building in Austin. OK, so I'm sorry, your name one more time? Maurice. Maurice saw the Capitol building in downtown Austin, and the Capitol building did not say, hey, Maurice, take a picture of me with Instagram. There was no information given to Maurice that this should be the behavior he should do, right? So what prompted Maurice to use Instagram? What was the itch? What was the internal trigger? I think it was this fear of losing the moment. That when Maurice saw something that he wanted to capture, something significant in his life, and he feared that that moment would disappear forever, he could capture it with this photography app called Instagram. Now, there was another company a few years ago, I think 20, 30 years back, that also used to own the moment. What company used to own the moment? Kodak. Do we all remember these schmaltzy commercials that Kodak used to run on TV, right? Do you remember these commercials that they would run time and time again? The puppy dogs running through the grass. The children who would someday leave the empty nest. My favorite commercial was the one they always ran of grandma blowing out perhaps her last birthday candles. Do we remember this commercial? Right? I'm not making it up. They really did run this commercial. But why did Kodak spend billions of dollars and almost 100 years running all these commercials and all this advertising around the Kodak moment? Well, they were smart enough to know that if they could create an association inside the user's brain, that when you see a moment like this in your life and you fear it disappearing forever, capture it with a Kodak camera. Now, what took Kodak almost 100 years and billions of dollars in advertising to do, Instagram did with 12 people in 18 months by having us users teach other users what the Instagram moment is all about. But of course, that's not the only thing that Instagram did well, because Instagram is much more than a way to capture a photo. It doesn't just scratch that itch. The more we use the product, the more we pass through the Instagram hook, we begin to associate its use with other internal triggers. When we're feeling bored or lonesome or FOMO, what's FOMO? Fear of missing out, right? You know that's an actual word in the Merriam-Webster dictionary as of 2 years ago? It's a real word. FOMO, fear of missing out, is a negative valence state. We don't like that sensation that we're missing out on something, and before we even realize what we're doing, we're already scratching that itch with this app found in our pockets. Make sense? All right, so let's move on to the next step of the hook, the action phase. The action phase of the hook is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of an immediate reward. The key word here is simplicity, the simplest behavior. Let me show you some examples of some habit-forming products, and I want you to see just how simple the key action is. Something as simple as a scroll on Pinterest, or entering a search term on Google. And what could be easier than just pushing the play button on YouTube? These incredibly simple behaviors done in anticipation of an immediate reward. And there's actually a formula to help us predict the likelihood of these singular behaviors. This one comes to us from a professor at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. Has anybody seen this before? A few of you? Oh, wow, less than I would have expected. This is a very powerful formula because it tells us that for any human behavior B, we only need three things. Any human behavior. Sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, that's the A, ability. Ability is how easy or difficult something is to do. And T stands for trigger. We just talked about triggers. So any human behavior only requires these three things: motivation, ability, and trigger. So let's dive in. We already talked about triggers. Let's talk about motivation and ability. Motivation, according to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, Deci tells us that motivation is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. Now, this is one of these areas of consumer psychology that we've been arguing about for years and years, but FOG gives us 6 basic levers that we can pull on to make somebody more likely to do a behavior by boosting motivation. Because all of us as human beings, we seek pleasure, we avoid pain. We seek hope, we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance, and we avoid social rejection. So every bit of copy on your website, every television commercial, every billboard ad you've ever seen is fundamentally at its core about manipulating one or more of these 6 levers of human motivation. But of course, M, the motivation, is only one part of B equals M.I.T. The second part, the A, stands for ability. Ability is the capacity to do a particular behavior. And here again, we have these 6 levers, these 6 things that we can pull on to make a behavior more likely to occur based on how much time something takes, how much money something costs, how much physical effort is required. Brain cycles. We're going to talk a lot today about brain cycles and cognitive load. Social deviance, right? Social deviance tells us that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And finally, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. And this is why habits are so important. Because the more we do a particular behavior, the easier it becomes, and the more likely we are to do it in the future. Now, what do we call that? It's called practice, right? The more we do it, the easier it becomes, the more likely we are to do it in the future. So we can actually plot these 3 elements on a graph that's very useful in a product development context. If there's a behavior that your user, your customer is not doing for one reason or another, you have a beautiful new app, a wonderful new website, whatever program it is that you've designed, whatever path you've designed for your user to take, and darn it, they're not doing the appropriate behavior, you can ask yourself, does the user have sufficient motivation? High motivation is at the top, low motivation is at the bottom. Does the user have sufficient ability? If something is easy to do, it's way over here on your right. If something is difficult to do, it's on the left. And when the user has sufficient motivation and sufficient ability, they cross that blue threshold. And when the trigger is present, the behavior will occur. Every single time. Online, offline, your behavior, your spouse's behavior, your kid's behavior, your customer or user's behavior, always, every single time requires sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger. If the behavior isn't occurring, it's one of these 3 things every time. Let's move on to the next step of the hook, the reward phase. Now, the reward phase is where the user's itch is scratched, where they get what they came for. But when we talk about rewards, we have to talk about the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain we call the Nucleus Accumbens. Now, the Nucleus Accumbens was first studied by 2 Canadian researchers in the 1940s by the name of Olds and Milner. And Olds and Milner hooked up the brains of these lab animals to a tiny circuit, and every time these animals would push on a lever, they would receive an electrical jolt to this part of the brain. And what Olds and Milner discovered was that these lab animals incessantly activated this part of the brain again and again and again. Some of the lab animals would forgo food and water and run across painful electrified grids just to continue to activate their nucleus accumbens. In later studies done on people, Olds and Milner discovered similar results. That when people were given this little button to press on, and every time they pressed on this button, they would receive an electrical jolt to their brains, these people did so hundreds of times. Some of the people had to have the machines forcibly removed, even when they were shut off, to get them to stop pressing this button. Now, it turns out that we don't need electrodes in our brains to activate the nucleus accumbens. In fact, your nucleus accumbens is activated every single day with things like junk food, luxury goods, sex, certain chemicals, and of course, right there in the center, our technology. All of these things activate the very same part of the brain every single day. Now, for decades, the psychology community believed that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure. Right? Why else would lab animals and later people incessantly activate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Well, not exactly. What we now know that Olds and Milner never did was that the way the brain gets us to act is not by stimulating pleasure per se, but by activating an itch that we call the stress of desire, this wanting, this craving reflex. We know this because in fMRI studies, we can actually see that the nucleus accumbens becomes most active in anticipation of getting a reward. But when we actually get the thing we want, the thing that's going to make us happy and finally make us feel good, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So the way the brain gets us to act is by stimulating this itch that we seek to scratch. It's not about pleasure, it's actually about the alleviation of pain, the stress of desire. And there is a way to supercharge this reaction. Did you know that we can actually manufacture desire? Anybody curious how to do that? Anybody want to know how? I'm doing it to you right now. Because when I took that long pause just now, and I stopped talking, some of you perked up. What's this guy doing? Why isn't he talking anymore? His cadence changed. What's going on? And it turns out that in all sorts of products that we find most habit-forming and most engaging, you will find an element of mystery, what we call a variable reward. This, of course, comes from the classic work of B.F. Skinner. Many of you might remember Skinner from your Psych 101 class back in college. The father of operant conditioning took these pigeons, he put them in a little box, he gave them a disc to peck at, and at first, every time they pecked at the disc, the pigeon would get a reward, a little food pellet. And so very quickly, Skinner determined that he could train these pigeons to peck at the disc whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something different. He introduced a variable reward. So sometimes the pigeon would peck at the disc, nothing would come out. No food pellet, no reward. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times these pigeons pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. Why does that happen? Because what we now know is that variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, creating this desirous response. And so in all sorts of products that you find most habit-forming, most engaging, the things that capture your attention and will not let go, both online and off, you will find one or more of these three types of variable rewards. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let me introduce these to you very briefly. Rewards of the tribe are about social rewards, things that feel good, that come from other people, and have this element of variability. So the search for empathetic joy, feeling good when someone else feels good, partnership, cooperation, competition, all examples of variable rewards of the tribe. Of course, the best example I can think of online is social media. Right? When you open up your Facebook feed, you're never quite sure what you're going to find. What photos might you see? Videos, perhaps. What are the comments going to say? How many likes does something get? High degree of variable reward, and all rewards of the tribe. Rewards of the hunt are the next type of variable reward. This is all about the search for resources or information. And this, of course, stems from our primal search for food and other material possessions. When many people think of rewards of the hunt, they often think of gambling, of slot machines. What makes gambling fun, if not habit-forming and sometimes all-out addictive, is this variable reward. You're not quite sure what you're going to win when you play these games of chance. Interestingly enough, we see the exact same psychology at work online. Have you all noticed how the feed is in everything these days? Why is that? Why is this feed mechanism in everything that's online? Right? Everything has a feed. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at LinkedIn, for example. When I open up LinkedIn, or you can substitute Twitter or Pinterest, take your pick. I start looking at this feed and I say, oh, that first article is not that interesting. Maybe the second is not that interesting, but maybe the third or fourth is interesting. And what do I have to do to get more of that interesting information? What do I have to do? Scroll. And that scrolling and scrolling uses the exact same psychology as pulling on a slot machine. Same exact psychology at work, searching and searching for that next bit of information, that next reward of the hunt. And finally, the last type of variable reward is the reward of the self, which is all about the search for self-achievement. These are things that are intrinsically pleasurable. They feel good in and of themselves. The search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. Good example online is gameplay. So when you play Angry Birds or Candy Crush or you name it, any one of these social games, you're not really even playing with other people. It's kind of a misnomer. They're called social. You're not really playing with other people. You're not winning anything in terms of material possessions, but there's something fun about getting to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement. And when I talk about games, many times people say, yeah, that's great, but look, this doesn't apply to me. I'm not a gamer. But if you're anything like me, you play this game every day. Does this look familiar? This game gets me every day, right? Checking that last unread message, or finishing the to-dos on your to-do list, or the thing that always gets me is that one app notification that I just have to open so I can clear it away, are all examples of this variable reward of the self, the search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. So one word of warning before you say to yourself, great, variable rewards, I got it. I'm going to put all kinds of variable rewards on my product, and it's going to be super habit forming. Let me give you one more piece of advice. Variable rewards are not a free pass. Okay? Variable rewards are not a free pass. There has to be a connection between the internal trigger and the variable reward. So if the internal trigger is boredom, well, then the variable reward has to entertain. But if the internal trigger is something else, let's say it's loneliness, seeking connection, well, then the variable reward damn well better connect people together. This is where gamification goes wrong. Right? Gamification, we all know, using game-like mechanics in non-gaming environments. That goes wrong because we do what's called serving chocolate-covered broccoli. Right? We smack on gamification, points, badges, leaderboards, but fundamentally it doesn't scratch the user's itch. So that's where this goes wrong, because what this variable reward phase is all about is giving the user what they came for, scratching the user's itch, and yet having a bit of mystery involved with what they might find the next time they use the product. Okay? Finally, the last step of the hook, and probably the most overlooked, is called the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product in anticipation of a future benefit, a future reward. And the point of the investment phase is to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook, and it does this in two ways. The first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by loading the next trigger, So for example, when I use WhatsApp, and I send someone a message, you can substitute Slack or any number of other messaging services here. When I send someone a message, there's no immediate gratification. Right? I don't get any points. I don't get badges. Nothing really happens when I send someone a message. But what I'm doing when I send that message is that I'm loading the next trigger because I'm likely to get a reply. And that reply comes coupled with, what's that an example of, that jewel icon? An external trigger prompting me through the hook once again. Okay, so loading the next trigger is something that the user does, their choice, on their accord, not some spam you're sending them, something that I chose to do that brings me back. That's the first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass. The next way is by storing value. Now, storing value is a really big deal. Storing value is why I love working in the technology industry as opposed to manufacturing per se, because everything in the physical world, these chairs, these tables, your clothing, everything in the physical world depreciates with wear and tear, right? It loses value the more we use it. But the amazing thing about habit-forming technology is that it appreciates. It should get better and more valuable the more we interact with it. For example, the more content I add to my Google Drive, the better it becomes as my one and only cloud storage solution. The more data I give to Mint.com, a personal finance software, or Pinterest, for example, the more data you give these sites, the better they become for you. They become customized for your needs based on your data. So if you were to log into my Pinterest account, it actually wouldn't be that interesting to you because it's been customized based on my data. Followers. The more followers someone has, the better the product becomes a way to reach their audience. So on Twitter, let's say tomorrow Twitter say, hey, look, we're having a rough patch here. We're going to need you to start paying for Twitter. Who's more likely to send Twitter money? Is it going to be someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with the 10,000 followers because they've invested all this stored value in the form of their follower count. And finally, reputation. Now, reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because my reputation on sites like Upwork or Airbnb or eBay dictate what I can charge for my goods and services. And how likely am I to leave one of these platforms after I've invested, after I've stored all this value in the form of my reputation? Which brings me to this cold, hard conclusion that, my friends, there is no rule written anywhere that I have ever seen that says the best product wins. Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen that anywhere, that there's a rule, the 11th commandment, that says the best product wins? It's not true. It's not the best product that wins. It's the product that can create a monopoly of the mind that captures the market. And it's by sending people through these 4 steps, by building an experience that scratches the user's itch, that solves their problem, by passing through these 4 steps of the hook. This is how user preferences are shaped, how tastes are formed, and how our habits take hold. So the most important slide of the presentation, this slide is the 5 fundamental questions that you've got to ask yourself if you're building a product that you want people to come to on their own, out of habit. You've got to be able to answer, number 1, what is the internal trigger? What's the user's itch? Number 2, what's the external trigger that prompts your user to action? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, what's the bit of work the user does to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook? Finally, one more thing I'd like to discuss before I go, and that is the morality of manipulation. I know what that nervous laughter is about. That many of you, I'm guessing, during my presentation were thinking, is this okay? Is this kosher to do to people, to use their hidden psychology to change what they do? And if you had that reaction, bravo. I think that is the appropriate, humane response to learning about the power of consumer psychology, because let's face it, anytime we are changing people's behaviors for our ends in mind, that is a form of manipulation. And so we need to be very careful about how we apply these techniques, because the technologies that we're building, these are the things that people take to bed with them every night. It's the first thing we reach for in the morning before we even say hello to our loved ones. And as Ian Bogost warns us, our technology is quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So what responsibility do we have as product designers, as builders, as engineers, as innovators? What responsibility do we have to use this capacity for good? Well, I encourage you to use what you learned here today to improve people's lives, to pick an important problem to fix. And I think we can do this by building healthy habits. Let me show you one quick example. This is a company called 7 Cups, which I'm proud to be an investor in as well. Called me up. Glenn is the founder of this company. Glenn Moriarty is a former psychotherapist who found that people who needed help weren't getting the therapy they needed because it's difficult, right? Think about that ability curve. It's time-consuming, hard to find a therapist. There's a social stigma. So if you're a parent of a child with a disability, let's say you're a veteran with PTSD, where do you go? Well, with this app, the internal trigger is needing someone to talk to. It's loneliness. The action couldn't be simpler. You open this app, you push a button, and you have someone to talk to. The variable reward is a variable reward of the tribe, connecting with another human being. And the investment phase, the last step of the hook, this is where it gets really good. As you are listened to, you're offered the opportunity to invest in becoming a listener yourself. And here's the kicker. The people who invest in learning how to listen to others get better more significantly than traditional therapy. This one app conducts 180,000 sessions per week in 140 languages in 130 countries. This is an example of how we can use habits for good to improve people's lives. So to close, I encourage you to borrow from the words of Gandhi, to build the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much.